She wasn't scheduled to die that day. Camille Delaney was still waiting in solitary confinement, day after day, for the date no one spoke out loud, the date she'd be strapped to a gurney and put to death. But on that morning, when two officers opened her cell at 6:53 a.m., Camille wasn't standing. She wasn't eating. She wasn't even breathing. She was face down on the cold concrete floor. There were no signs of a struggle, no hanging rope, no pills, no blood on the walls, just a quiet body, a damp mattress, and something the guards didn't understand at first. There was blood between her thighs, and something moving beneath her underwear. When the coroner arrived, he asked the guards only one question: was she pregnant? They laughed. Of course not. Camille had been in isolation for over a year. No male contact, no visits, no opportunity. But when the autopsy began, everything changed. She was 12 weeks pregnant, and her underwear was filled with live maggots. In that moment, the question was no longer how she died. It was what the hell had they done to her while she was still alive. Camille Delaney was 27 years old. She had been on death row for 1,027 days. She didn't have any family left who would come visit. No lawyer fighting for clemency. No journalists writing her story. Her name barely existed outside of that concrete complex anymore. She lived alone in a solitary unit, in a small concrete cell with no windows, no mirrors, and no sound but the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the distant clang of metal doors. The only human interaction she received came in the form of medication, meal trays, and the occasional restraint order. To the prison, Camille was no longer a woman. She was a number, a sentence, a body on hold. That morning began like all the others. The night shift had logged her as active but nonverbal at 4:17 a.m. That was standard. Camille hadn't spoken to staff in nearly 5 weeks. At 6:02 a.m., Nurse Patricia Wu signed off on her daily visual wellness check through the reinforced door window. She marked the clipboard lying on bed. No distress. At 6:48 a.m., a corrections officer named Roger Fielding returned to deliver Camille's breakfast tray. He knocked twice. No response. He knocked again. Harder. Still silence. By 6:53 a.m., Fielding used his override key and opened the cell door. What he saw was not unusual at first. Camille was lying face down on the floor beside her bed. Her body was still. Her palms were open. Her face was turned to the side, eyes slightly parted. But something felt wrong. Her skin wasn't warm. Her lips weren't moving. She wasn't asleep. And she wasn't breathing. Fielding called in a code blue. Within minutes, a medic team arrived, followed by a prison sergeant and the internal incident photographer. Camille's body was turned over. There was no blood on the floor, no bruising on the wrists or neck, no signs of vomiting, self-harm, or physical trauma. Her mouth and nose were clean. Her eyes were open. Her stomach was soft. At first, the medical responders speculated a silent cardiac event or seizure, but then someone lifted her bedsheet and saw the dampness. There was blood on her thighs. Not a lot, but enough to soak the inner lining of her underwear. And then, they saw something else. Movement, small, pale threads, writhing under the cotton seam. Maggots. The room froze. For a moment, no one knew what to do. This wasn't something the officers were trained to handle. Not for a woman who had been alive and coherent just one day earlier. Not for someone whose body should not have been decomposing at all. Camille had died less than an hour before they found her, and already there were maggots between her legs. The sergeant gave the order to secure the scene. Photos were taken. Her body was covered, tagged, and wheeled to the medical van. The cell was sealed off. Camille Delaney death row inmate number 71642 was officially declared deceased at 7:12 a.m. Her file was marked for internal review, cause of death under investigation. But within 48 hours, that review would be escalated because the autopsy revealed something no one was prepared for. The autopsy began just before noon. Camille's body had been transported to the Regional Medical Examiner's Office, a sterile, tiled facility used for all state-involved deaths, especially those that occurred behind bars. The pathologist assigned was Dr. Joel Halloran, a quiet man with 30 years of experience. He had examined overdose victims, suicide cases, and more than a few brutal assaults inside correctional institutions. But when he unzipped the white body bag and peeled back the sheet, he immediately sensed this one would be different. Camille's body was pale but intact. No major bruising, no lacerations. Her fingernails were clean, her pupils fixed. Initial inspection of her airways showed no signs of obstruction. Heart and lungs were consistent with someone in good health, though there was slight fluid retention in her lungs, not enough to point toward drowning or pulmonary failure. Then came the lower abdomen. When Dr. Halloran palpated Camille's uterus, he paused. It was enlarged, more than it should be. He ran a gloved hand over her stomach again, and again felt the firmness, the shape. He turned to the technician beside him and ordered an ultrasound, even though the patient was already deceased. 30 minutes later, the monitor showed it clearly. A 12-week-old fetus. Fully formed spine, beating heart until just hours ago, head, limbs, and tiny digits, nestled inside a woman who, according to prison records, had not had physical contact with a man in over 3 years. The room went silent. The assistant stared at the screen, her eyes wide. Dr. Halloran sat back, breathing heavily through his mask. "Get me her intake file," he said. "Now." The report came quickly. Camille had been in solitary confinement for 14 consecutive months. No conjugal visits, no contact with male inmates, no scheduled outside medical appointments. Her chart listed no complaints of illness, missed periods, or pregnancy-related symptoms. There were no rape kits logged, no assault reports, nothing. It didn't make sense. The doctor proceeded with the internal examination. That's when the true horror revealed itself. Camille's cervix and vaginal canal showed signs of inflammation, subtle but present. There were micro-abrasions near the cervical wall, but no signs of recent trauma. What was more concerning was the presence of tissue necrosis near the perineum skin that had begun to rot from the inside out. Beneath her underwear, now in an evidence bag, something moved. Dr. Halloran requested a closer inspection. Under magnification, the lab tech confirmed it live maggots in the cotton lining. Most disturbing of all, the larvae were not only in the garment itself, but also found embedded in the folds of skin nesting, feeding, and growing. Not from decomposition, not from time, but from deliberate biological introduction. Someone had exposed Camille's body to living parasites while she was still alive. Dr. Halloran stopped the procedure. He requested the Department of Corrections representative be notified immediately. The autopsy notes were sealed under a temporary hold. The fetus was preserved for further testing. The undergarment was labeled Priority Evidence Category Red. That night, he wrote only one line in his personal logbook. Pregnant, 12 weeks, maggots present prior to death, suspected assault by non-traditional means. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't just assault. It was something else. Something deeper, darker, and carefully designed. Camille Delaney wasn't always silent. There was a time she screamed louder than anyone else. She entered the state correctional system at age 24, convicted of second-degree murder after stabbing a man in a motel room. The victim was her ex-boyfriend. He had broken her jaw a month earlier. The prosecution claimed it was premeditated revenge. Camille never denied killing him, but her public defender failed to raise the years of documented abuse. The jury returned a guilty verdict in less than 2 hours. She was sentenced to death. At first, Camille was placed in general population at Elmridge Women's Correctional Facility. She spent her first 4 months complying with orders, attending group therapy, and working in the prison laundry. She was quiet, but observant. She took notes. She noticed things other inmates ignored. The guards had favorites. Some women disappeared for hours at a time. Others returned shaken, bruised, or eerily numb. And then, it was her turn. It started small. A male officer offered her extra soap, then cleaner bedsheets, then asked to talk after hours. Camille refused, politely, at first, then with disgust. The next day, her cell was trashed during a random inspection. Her commissary privileges were suspended. Her medication dosages changed. Weeks later, Camille filed a formal complaint, sexual coercion, by Officer M. Rudner. She submitted a handwritten report. Another inmate, Celia Ross, agreed to corroborate her story. 3 days after that, Camille was transferred without warning to the isolation wing. Celia was placed in administrative segregation for contraband discovery. Neither of them were seen in public areas again. From that point forward, Camille's record changed. She was labeled as volatile, uncooperative, resistant to authority. Her infractions increased, failing to follow orders, disobeying search procedures, refusing injections. She was accused of threatening language toward medical staff, but none of the logs ever quoted her directly. The charges were always vague, administrative, sanitized. One nurse who treated Camille Elena Marquez remembered a chilling moment. During a routine wellness check, Camille pulled her close and whispered, "I'm not sick. I'm being used. There's something inside me that doesn't belong." Elena asked what she meant. Camille looked at the camera in the corner of the ceiling, then said nothing more. That report was never filed. Instead, Camille's chart showed an uptick in non-compliance. She refused sedatives. She was forcibly restrained. Her blood work became more frequent. No one explained why. When she began bleeding irregularly, she was told it was hormonal imbalance. When she began vomiting after injections, they said it was stress-induced. But the guards stopped offering her soap. They stopped offering anything at all. The system had labeled her a threat, and threats in that prison didn't get attention. They got silence. Camille never filed another complaint. But she never stopped watching, never stopped resisting. And someone, somewhere inside that prison, wanted her to stop. Permanently. After Camille's autopsy, the internal review began. At first, it followed protocol: check the death log, interview the staff, freeze the security footage, collect Camille's medication records. But the deeper they looked, the stranger it got. The footage from the camera outside Camille's cell was corrupted. According to the logs, it had suffered a software error 3 days prior to her death. The backup drive missing, under repair. There was no surveillance record for the final 72 hours of her life. Her medical file was even more troubling. Over the past 14 months, Camille had received 49 undocumented injections, twice the average of any other inmate in isolation. Each one was signed off by a rotating roster of substitute nurses, many of whom no longer worked at the facility. None of the medication names were listed, only initials like PRD or NTX6. When the Department of Corrections contacted the prison's healthcare contractor for clarification, they received an automated reply: research protocols confidential. Refer to authorization agreement. Authorization: there shouldn't have been any research protocol. A formal subpoena was issued. Within 48 hours, a sealed folder was delivered to the Bureau of Prisons. It was stamped Internal Medical Observation Program Tier 3. Subject file. Inside 12 names. All female. All inmates from Elmridge. Camille was number 5. The file included hormone tracking charts, behavioral assessments, blood test data, and a chilling label: FPR Initiative, Female Physiological Resilience. According to the document, The purpose of the program was to monitor extreme biological adaptability under confinement stress and variable hormonal interference. In other words, they were experimenting on women without consent, without oversight, inside a government-funded prison. No formal ethics board had approved the program. No research university had claimed ownership. No journal had ever published its findings. It was invisible science, conducted in silence, and Camille wasn't the only one. Among the 12 names, 5 were already marked deceased, 2 were transferred, location sealed, the remaining 4. Their current status was unknown. Their files ended abruptly. No release forms, no transfer dates, no follow-up. Camille's entries were the most detailed. Her response to chemical interference was noted as hypersensitive. Her psychological profile was marked, displays instinctive resistance to environmental control, risk of narrative disclosure elevated, and the final comment, written 6 weeks before her death. Subject demonstrating early-stage gestational development. Proceed with Phase 2 monitoring. Watch for escalation. No one ever explained what Phase 2 meant. But the implications were undeniable. Camille hadn't just become pregnant. She had been made pregnant, intentionally, in the name of science, in the name of control. And by the time her body was found, they were already preparing for the next phase on someone else. Elena Marquez had been a nurse at Elm Ridge Women's Correctional Facility for nearly 6 years. She didn't work there because she believed in punishment. She worked there because, once upon a time, she believed in redemption. She thought she could make a difference, help women reclaim their health, regain their sense of self, and maybe survive the sentence with their dignity intact. But Elm Ridge wasn't that kind of place. Over time, Elena stopped trying to fix what was broken. She just kept her head down, followed orders, and did her job. Until she met Camille Delaney. From the first day, something about Camille stood out. She didn't flinch like the others. She didn't plead. Her silence wasn't submission, it was deliberate. Her eyes always searching, always tracking, always resisting. Elena noticed how Camille's medical file never stopped growing, how the dosages she was ordered to administer kept changing, increasing, and arriving without explanation. Camille never asked for help, but she left signs. A slip of paper in a waste bin with the word, "Stop." A folded tissue smeared with blood tucked under a tray. A whispered line during one of their brief eye contacts. "If they find out I told you, they'll use you next." The day Camille died, Elena was off shift. She found out through a coworker's hushed phone call. "Did you hear the voice said, 'She's dead. Camille. They found her this morning.'" Then silence. "Don't ask questions. Just don't." But Elena couldn't ignore it. She requested to see the body. She was denied. She requested access to Camille's final chart. Denied again. 2 days later, Elena quit. No notice. No explanation. She packed her things, deleted her access credentials, and disappeared from the staff roster. But she didn't go quietly. 4 weeks after Camille's death, the Bureau of Prisons received a thick manila envelope. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside, a full printed copy of Camille's sealed autopsy. Photos of Camille's underwear with a timestamp. A spreadsheet of undocumented injections. And a handwritten letter, 5 pages long. The letter wasn't emotional. It wasn't even accusatory. It was clinical, restrained, and written like a report. But one sentence stood out in jagged black ink. "There are women inside Elm Ridge who are being used as test subjects under a program no one will admit exists. Camille Delaney died pregnant, alone, and infested. That should never happen to anyone again." The letter was signed with only a single letter E. The Bureau of Prisons flagged it immediately. A federal inquiry was opened. All experiments within Elm Ridge were ordered suspended pending investigation. The prison's warden was placed on administrative leave. The internal medical contractor issued a public statement denying any knowledge of experimental practices. But it was too late to cover it all, because the letter had already been copied and leaked to the press. The federal task force arrived at Elmridge 1 week after the letter was received. They came without announcement, 6 investigators, led by Special Agent Mallory Quinn, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for exposing abuses in privatized corrections. Within an hour of arrival, she had seized access to all medical archives, surveillance footage, staffing logs, and electronic communications from the past 18 months. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Too ordinary. The surveillance data was neatly organized. No missing days, no corrupted drives. Camille's cell showed standard motion-triggered logs, maintenance checks, meal drops, and nurse visits. But when Agent Quinn's tech team cross-referenced the timestamps with staff sign-ins, things didn't match. On 4 separate days, Camille was recorded receiving injections, but the nurses allegedly administering them had not signed in. In fact, one of them had been out of state. Another had already quit. The time codes were clean. The faces on the video were obscured. The audio channels were muted. Someone had edited the footage badly. The real surveillance server logs told a different story. A secondary backup file, hidden in a partitioned volume, revealed data gaps entire hours where no recording had occurred. And not just in Camille's wing. 8 different solitary cells showed the same pattern, repeated 3-hour voids every Tuesday and Thursday, between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. They called it dead time, and it was always during the same period when undocumented injections had been logged. Then came the staffing files. Camille's medical chart, submitted during the internal review, listed a dozen interactions with Nurse Patricia Wu, but when Agent Quinn interviewed Wu directly, she was stunned. "I haven't treated Camille since last year," Wu said. "They told me she'd been transferred to restricted medical supervision. I didn't even know she was still in the facility." The signature on Camille's chart forged, the entries fabricated, entire medical interactions invented to give the illusion of continuous care. Even more disturbing, Camille's medication labels were not traceable to any known pharmaceutical supplier. The inventory logs listed them as experimental support supplements, but the barcodes on the packaging matched a different system, one used internally by a private biotech company called Halden Praxis Research, known for subcontracting high-risk clinical studies inside prison environments. Halden had no published records, no listed board, no trial approvals, but in confidential contracts acquired through subpoena, Agent Quinn found it. Proposal 309B, Correctional Resilience Conditioning via Hormonal Challenge, CRC-HC. The funding came from a federal pilot program under the Department of Correctional Innovation. The objective test hormonal manipulation and reproductive viability under conditions of extreme confinement. In short, they weren't just studying stress, they were testing how far a woman's body could be pushed before it broke. And Camille, silent, isolated, unmonitored, had become the perfect test subject. What stunned the agents most wasn't the cruelty, it was the control. Every report, every video, every dose, falsified, protected, disappearing into a bureaucratic maze of fake documentation and misdirection. Elmridge wasn't just a prison, it was a closed-loop experiment where truth was edited in real time, and no one on the outside had ever seen the raw feed. Until now. The list contained 12 names. All women, all inmates from Elmridge, all listed under the same program, FPR Initiative, Tier 3. Camille was number 5. The agent started with the easiest case, inmate number 2, Shannon Brooks, 29 years old, booked on federal weapons charges. She had died 2 years earlier, reportedly from severe sepsis after untreated dental infection, a rare but possible condition. except her medical file, once unsealed, showed an entirely different story. Shannon had filed 6 complaints of abdominal pain, nausea, and dizziness over 3 months. No dental issues. She was administered a hormone called PRD4 23 times. The compound didn't appear in any pharmaceutical index. No one ever explained what it was. She collapsed in the shower on a Thursday, was dead before they could move her. The official report infection, the unofficial one toxic organ failure. Next was inmate number 9, Teresa Lambert, a quiet woman convicted of fraud and mail theft. Her record was clean, but she was transferred in early 2024. Her paperwork ended with a single-line status change, relocation under special custody order. She was never heard from again. No forwarding facility, no release, no death certificate. She simply vanished. Then there was inmate number 7, Rebecca Lynn. Hers was the hardest to read. Rebecca had been a mother before her arrest. She had 3 kids. She'd been convicted of embezzlement, sentenced to 5 years but ended up in the FPR program. Her letters to her children grew erratic. She stopped mentioning her own name. She wrote in symbols. Her final letter, intercepted by prison staff but later recovered by investigators, contained only 4 words. "Something's growing inside me." Her death was ruled a suicide. She allegedly swallowed a piece of glass from a shattered mirror, but Elmridge didn't allow mirrors in solitary. All 12 women in the list had similar gaps in their records: missing logs, corrupted footage, and unexplained injections. Some died suddenly. Some vanished without a trace. Some, like Camille, had raised red flags just before their deaths. All had been listed as showing resistance to program protocols. And one more detail connected them. Every single one had their reproductive cycle logged weekly. Even if they were postmenopausal, even if they were on birth control, even if they'd had prior sterilization procedures. Why? Because the program wasn't tracking behavior, it was tracking fertility. It wasn't just torture, it wasn't just psychological manipulation. They were trying to breed something, or someone. By the end of that week, Agent Quinn knew the truth. Camille hadn't died in isolation. She had died in the middle of a controlled laboratory, wearing a prison uniform, bleeding through state-issued underwear, with a 12-week-old fetus inside her, and live maggots feeding on her flesh. She wasn't a threat. She was a prototype. And the experiment wasn't over. The fetus was preserved. After the autopsy, it had been removed under strict federal supervision and sent to an off-site forensic lab for full genetic and biological analysis. It wasn't just protocol, it was necessity. Because no one could explain how Camille Delaney, isolated for over a year with no male contact, had become pregnant. No one could explain why her uterus showed signs of chemical overstimulation, why her hormone levels had fluctuated erratically for months, why her vaginal tissue exhibited microlesions consistent with repeated instrumentation. And then there were the maggots. A forensic entomologist confirmed they had been deliberately introduced. Not from environmental contamination, not post-mortem. They were embedded while Camille was still alive, implanted in moist tissue, likely under sedation, through direct contact. The strain was modified, lab-cultured, genetically tagged with a protein marker used only in experimental studies of biodegradation. It was human experimentation. Sanctioned or not, it had happened, and Camille had suffered all of it. But nothing compared to what came next. 3 weeks after the fetus was extracted, the genetic report arrived. It wasn't a full match to Camille, 50% maternal DNA, as expected, but the other half. It didn't match any known individual in the federal inmate DNA database, nor any male staff member at Elmridge, nor any state donor registry. Instead, the paternal side showed synthetic gene splicing a sequence flagged by forensic AI as artificially constructed. Sections of the genome bore markers consistent with recombinant DNA work. Put simply, the fetus wasn't fathered by a man. It was engineered. Whoever had impregnated Camille didn't use traditional fertilization. They used a biologically modified embryo, activated and implanted through covert medical procedures, likely during sedation, possibly through false injections, and monitored across multiple trimesters without her consent. The fetus was real, it was living, but it had been built. Designed for what? No one knew. Enhanced resilience, cross-species research, or something darker, an attempt to use prison populations for reproductive testing, away from the public eye. And Camille. Camille was the proof of concept. The trauma to her system wasn't from pregnancy alone. It came from immune rejection, rapid gestational acceleration, and chemical conflict between her body and the fetus. The maggots possibly inserted to study tissue necrosis in parallel, a biological trial within a biological trial. Layered cruelty. And someone had signed off on it, someone high enough to override the usual approvals, someone powerful enough to erase names, logs, and entire people. By now, Agent Quinn had seen enough. She contacted the Department of Justice. A formal criminal investigation was launched. But she knew the truth in her gut. This wasn't science gone rogue. This was a program refined, financed, and ongoing. When the truth began to surface, it didn't explode. It leaked. Slowly, systematically, through redacted memos, through anonymous whistleblowers, through files that had been lost, then mysteriously found in encrypted archives. It began with a grant, a line item in a federal budget allocation titled Correctional Rehabilitation Research, Women's Health. $8.2 million, distributed over 4 years, no public hearings, no oversight, just a rubber stamp and a signature from a mid-level official in the Department of Correctional Innovation. The recipient, Halden Praxis Research, a private biotech firm with no physical headquarters, no board of directors, and a P.O. box in Maryland. Their specialty was reproductive resilience technologies. Their funding came not from universities, but from defense contractors. They didn't publish in journals, they didn't speak at conferences, but they had access to prisons, to people, to women like Camille. Halden subcontracted with Elmridge through a shadow contract bundled into the prison's medical outsourcing agreement. The terms included clinical discretion for certain trial protocols and temporary suspension of informed consent requirements under Tier 3 custodial conditions. In other words, they could experiment without telling the inmates, and they did. The Bureau of Prisons claimed ignorance, the warden claimed paperwork confusion, the healthcare provider claimed compliance with all legal standards. But Agent Quinn found the emails. One from a Halden administrator to Elmridge's head medic read, Subject number 5, Delaney continues to show irregular resistance to hormonal priming. Recommend transition to Phase 2 via nutrient modification and nocturnal monitoring. Keep sedation window under 90 minutes to avoid detection. Another. Encourage staff to log fabricated behavioral incidents to justify injection frequency. Non-cooperative designation essential to protocol. They weren't just covering up abuse, they were engineering the narrative on paper, in videos, in language, so that if anyone ever looked, Camille would seem unstable, erratic, and dangerous. Not pregnant, not sick, just difficult. That was the brilliance of the system. It didn't need to hide the truth. It rewrote it. Even the maggots had a place. One memo detailed the use of controlled larval necrosis agents for tissue regression studies originally tested on lab rats, now piloted under secure correctional conditions. They had done it before. They were planning to do it again. 6 prisons across 3 states, dozens of female inmates, all chosen for one reason: no one would believe them. They were poor, they were criminals, they were disposable. And the people funding the system knew it. Camille's death was never supposed to make headlines. Her body was meant to be cremated, her chart quietly closed, her fetus buried under medical jargon, her suffering deleted in code. But someone slipped, a nurse with a conscience, a corrupted hard drive, a letter that refused to stay silent. And now, the system was exposed for what it really was. Not justice, not research, not punishment. A machine that fed on silence and called it science. They tried to erase her, but she refused to vanish. When the story broke, it wasn't front-page news, just a single column in a regional paper. Death row inmate's autopsy reveals pregnancy, biological tampering alleged. But that story caught fire. By the end of the week, 5 outlets were investigating. By the end of the month, Elmridge's name was trending alongside words like experiment, cover-up, and female prisoners used as test subjects. Camille's photo, her intake mugshot, eyes unblinking, jaw tight, was on every screen. People wanted to know, how did a woman under 24-hour surveillance end up pregnant? How did live larvae end up inside her body? Why was her chart forged, her footage erased, her silence rewarded with death? Congress launched an emergency inquiry. The Bureau of Prisons suspended all external medical research partnerships. The Department of Justice issued subpoenas. Elmridge was shut down. Its warden resigned. The warden's deputy disappeared. But none of that brought Camille back. The fetus was buried in a private cemetery under a name she never got to give it. No family claimed her body. So she was buried to a shared grave. One stone, one name. Camille Delaney, 1998-2025. She did not consent. But the legacy she left couldn't be buried. In the months that followed, 3 other prisons were forced to release female inmates from solitary confinement due to similar allegations. Lawsuits were filed. Whistleblowers emerged. One woman wrote an op-ed from behind bars. "We are not rats. We are not empty wombs. We are women. And we remember Camille." Elena Marquez, the nurse who sent the letter, was never publicly identified, but she sent one final message, a handwritten note to Agent Quinn. "I couldn't save her, but I could stop the next one. That's the only reason I ever wore the badge." The system still stands, reformed, renamed, repackaged. But now it's watched. Because Camille made the world look, not with a scream, not with a riot, but with a body that told the truth, when no one else could. Thông điệp cuối cùng. A death row inmate may have committed a crime, but that does not give society the right to experiment on her body like an animal. She was a prisoner, not a specimen, and what was done to her should never be done to anyone again.